The knock came at 9 on a Tuesday. Arthur expected a misdelivered package. Instead, he found a 7-year-old girl in silk pajamas clutching a manila folder. She didn't cry. She didn't ask for candy. She just looked up with eyes too old for her small face and whispered, "I need a father by Friday." The kicker, her mother was the ruthless billionaire next door, and this wasn't a plea for help. It was a business proposition. The water in the sink was tepid and smelled faintly of sour milk and lemon soap. Arthur scraped his thumbnail against a hardened patch of macaroni stuck to the bottom of a cheap aluminum pan. His knuckles were cracked, bleeding slightly at the joints from the dry October air and the dust of the construction site he'd spent the last 10 hours supervising. In the next room, the television murmured a low, canned laugh track, masking the rhythmic breathing of his 8-year-old son, Toby, who had fallen asleep on the faded corduroy sofa. Arthur sighed, letting the pan slip beneath the greyish suds. He was 34, running on 4 hours of sleep, and his lower back carried a dull, persistent throb. He dried his hands on a towel that had lost its plushness half a decade ago. Then came the knock. It wasn't a frantic pounding, nor the heavy, authoritative rap of a bill collector. It was 3 distinct, evenly spaced taps. Low on the door, Arthur wiped a hand across his jaw, feeling the harsh stubble, and walked down the short, narrow hallway. The floorboards whined under his work boots. He undid the deadbolt, expecting to find the teenager from 4B, looking for a jump start. He swung the door open. The porch light flickered, casting a sickly yellow glow over the welcome mat. Nobody was there. He leaned out the chill of the autumn night, biting through his thin flannel shirt. He was about to shut the door, when a subtle movement caught his eye. Down. A little girl stood perfectly still on his porch. She was tiny, maybe 7 years old, wearing a matching set of navy blue silk pajamas piped in white. Her dark hair was braided into 2 immaculate plaits. She didn't look lost. She looked like she was waiting for a subordinate to finish speaking. "Can I help you, kid?" Arthur asked, his voice gravelly from disuse and exhaustion. "Are you Arthur Pendleton?" Her voice was crisp, unnervingly steady. "Depends on who's asking." "I am Chloe. I live at 1400 Crestview Drive." Arthur blinked. 1400 Crestview was the property abutting his small half-acre lot. It wasn't a house. It was a fortress. High iron gates, perimeter cameras, and a sprawling modernist mansion of glass and black steel that had been erected 6 months ago. The owner was a ghost, rumored to be some tech CEO, who bought the land just to tear down the historic estate that used to sit there. "Okay, Chloe," Arthur said, leaning against the doorframe. The smell of damp pine needles drifted from the yard. "It's past 9. Where are your parents?" "My mother is on a conference call with Zurich," Chloe said plainly. "My nanny Beatrice took a muscle relaxant at 8:15 and is currently unresponsive in the West Wing." Arthur rubbed his temples. "Unresponsive like dead or unresponsive like asleep?" "Sleeping heavily. She drools," Chloe clarified. She lifted her right hand. Clasped in her small, pale fingers was a crisp, heavy-stock manila folder. She held it out toward him. Arthur stared at it, then at her. He didn't take it. "What's this? A proposal," she said. She didn't waver. Her eyes, a striking, icy grey, held his gaze. "I need a father by Friday." Arthur let out a short, breathy laugh. He couldn't help it. It was too absurd. He looked past her, half expecting to see a hidden camera crew in the rhododendrons. "Look, kid, I don't know what kind of game. Oak Ridge Academy is hosting a family heritage breakfast this Friday at 8 a.m. Chloe interrupted her tone, sharpening just a fraction. "Attendance is mandatory. Fathers are required to participate in the 3-legged race and the tie-tying seminar. My mother flies to Tokyo on Thursday. She informed me I would have to miss the event. I find this unacceptable. Arthur finally took the folder. The paper felt thick, expensive. He flipped it open. Inside was a single sheet of heavy bond paper. Written on it in meticulously neat dark blue crayon were terms. Item 1. Show up at 7:45 a.m. Item 2. Wear a suit. Not the plaid shirt. Item 3. Do not embarrass me. Compensation $500. Arthur stared at the crayon strokes. The contradiction hit him in the chest. It was a corporate contract drafted by a child who barely knew cursive. It was hilarious. It was profoundly depressing. $500, Arthur muttered. I have it in a lockbox, Chloe assured him. Cash, unmarked bills. Where did you even learn the phrase unmarked bills? Arthur sighed, closing the folder. He ran a hand through his hair. He wanted a beer. He wanted to sleep. He didn't want to deal with a miniature executive suffering from the extreme parental neglect. Listen, Chloe, I can't be your dad on Friday. It doesn't work like that. The school will know I'm not him. You are a white male between the ages of 30 and 45. If you put on a tie and look mildly annoyed, they will ask no questions, she replied smoothly. Arthur choked on a laugh. God, she was cynical. I appreciate the offer. But no, come on. I'm walking you home before the cops get called. I will double it, she said, her voice dropping a register, a hint of genuine desperation finally cracking through the sterile veneer. 1,000. Arthur stopped. $1,000. His truck needed a new alternator. Toby's winter coat was too short in the sleeves. The leaking roof above the kitchen was going to give way before Thanksgiving. His pride immediately flared up, hot and ugly. He wasn't a rent-a-dad. He wasn't a charity case for the billionaire next door. No. Arthur said harsher than he intended. Chloe flinched. Just a micro-expression, a tight pull at the corners of her mouth, but he saw it. Instantly he felt like garbage. Look, he softened his voice. Let's just get you back. We'll talk to your mum. She won't care, Chloe whispered, looking down at the scuffed toes of Arthur's boots. We'll see, Arthur said. He stepped out onto the porch, pulling the front door shut behind him until the latch clicked. Lead the way, boss. The morning sun didn't warm the Hayes estate. The house absorbed the light, its massive black-tinted windows reflecting the grey autumn sky like a fortress of obsidian. Arthur walked up the quarter-mile driveway at 7:30 the next morning, feeling the aggressive crunch of crushed gravel beneath his boots. He had walked Chloe home the night before, handing her off to a deeply apologetic and heavily sedated nanny who had stumbled out of a side door. Arthur hadn't seen the mother. He hadn't pressed the issue. But he woke up at 5 a.m. with the image of that crayon contract burning in his mind. He was angry. He was angry at a woman he had never met for letting a 7-year-old wander onto a dark road to hire a substitute parent. He reached the front entrance, a massive slab of pivot-hinged oak. He didn't look for a doorbell. He just knocked hard with his knuckles. A minute passed. Then the heavy door swung open inward, making no sound. A woman stood there. She looked to be in her mid-30s, wearing a tailored charcoal pantsuit that probably cost more than Arthur's truck. Her hair, a stark ash blonde, was pulled back into a severe sleek knot. She held a phone to her ear, a ceramic mug of coffee in her other hand. The smell wafted out, rich, dark Ethiopian roast, cutting sharply through the crisp morning air. She looked at him. Her eyes were the exact same icy grey as Chloe's, but colder. Empty. Tell legal to stall the merger until Monday, she was saying into the phone. She didn't break eye contact with Arthur. She looked him up and down, his faded jeans, his canvas jacket. Hold on, David. She lowered the phone. The landscaping crew uses the service entrance on the east perimeter. Don't knock on the front door again." She started to close it. Arthur threw his boot over the threshold. The heavy oak hit the steel toe of his work boot and stopped with a dull thud. The woman's eyes narrowed. "Remove your foot." "Are you Victoria Hayes?" Arthur asked. "Who is asking?" "Arthur Pendleton. I live next door, at the brick house." Victoria glanced past him, as if noticing the modest, slightly run-down property visible through the trees for the first time. "Right. The eyesore. What do you want?" "A noise complaint. Send it to my assistant." "I don't give a damn about your noise," Arthur said, his voice flat. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the manila folder. He held it out. "Your daughter came to my house last night at 9 o'clock. Alone." Victoria froze. The phone in her hand lowered completely. For a fraction of a second, a crack appeared in her armor, a flicker of pure, unadulterated panic. But it vanished so quickly, Arthur wondered if he'd imagined it. She set her coffee mug down on a sleek console table in the foyer. "Chloe left the perimeter?" she asked. Her voice was quiet now. "Dangerous." "She knocked on my door and tried to hire me," Arthur said. He thrust the folder closer. Victoria took it, her manicured fingers brushing the rough paper. She opened it. She read the blue crayon. A muscle in her jaw jumped. Beatrice was supposed to be watching her. Beatrice was high on muscle relaxants, Arthur supplied unhelpfully. Victoria closed her eyes for a brief moment, letting out a measured, perfectly controlled exhale. When she opened them, the calculation was back. The CAO had returned. "I see. I apologize for the intrusion, Mr. Pendleton. Beatrice will be terminated by noon. It won't happen again." She handed the folder back to him. The dismissal was absolute. Arthur didn't take it. "That's it. You fire the nanny and go back to your calls." Victoria's gaze snapped up to his. "Excuse me. Your kid is wandering the neighborhood in the dark, trying to buy a dad because you're too busy to eat pancakes at her school," Arthur said. The anger was rising now, thick and hot in his throat. It wasn't his business. He knew it wasn't. But he kept seeing Toby's face when Arthur made it to his baseball games. He kept seeing Chloe's empty old eyes. "You have no idea what my schedule dictates, nor do you have the right to lecture me on my parenting." Victoria said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "I provide for her. Completely. Providing isn't parenting." "How remarkably quaint," she sneered. She looked at his hands, rough and calloused, then up to his tired face. "Let's skip the moral posturing. You came here for a reason. You didn't just come to return a piece of paper." Arthur clenched his jaw. "I came to make sure you knew your kid was slipping through the cracks." "Fine. I know. Now, how much?" "What?" Victoria stepped back, pulling a slim leather wallet from the inside of her jacket. "She offered you $500. Clearly you think you can leverage this for more. My time is worth roughly $3,000 an hour. Arguing with you is losing me money. I'll pay you $5,000 to sign a non-disclosure agreement regarding the Beatrice incident and to attend the breakfast on Friday. It solves my scheduling conflict, it placates Chloe, and it fixes whatever financial deficit you're currently drowning in." Arthur stared at her. He felt physically sick. The sheer audacity, the cold, clinical transaction of it all. He wanted to spit on her marble floor. He wanted to tell her to go to hell, turn around, and walk back to his leaky roof and his rusted truck. He opened his mouth to refuse, but then he felt the dampness in his left boot where the sole was splitting. He thought of the stack of final notice bills on his kitchen counter. $5,000. It would fix the roof. It would buy Toby the coat, the new cleats, the groceries for 3 months. He hated her. But in that exact second, he hated himself more. Arthur looked at the crisp checkbook she had produced. He swallowed the bitter taste of his own pride. "Make it payable to cash," he said, his voice hollow. "And I want black coffee at the breakfast." Victoria didn't smile, but a shadow of triumph crossed her face. "Friday, 7:45, don't be late." She shut the door in his face. The suit smelled of mothballs and despair. Arthur stood in front of the warped bathroom mirror, fighting a zipper that hadn't moved since his father's funeral 5 years ago. The charcoal fabric was stiff, the cut boxy and aggressively out of style. He managed to force a safety pin into the broken clasp of the trousers, praying his belt would hide the metal gleam. He splashed cold water on his face, drying it roughly with a towel that smelled like damp cotton. He had dropped Toby at Mrs. Gable's down the street at 6:30. The guilt of paying a neighbor $20 to watch his own kid so he could go pretend to be someone else's dad for a payout sat like a lead weight in his stomach. He patted his jacket pocket. Victoria's $5,000 check was folded inside. It burned against his ribs. Oak Ridge Academy didn't look like a school. It looked like a country club that had accidentally ordered chalkboards. The parking lot was a sea of German engineering and polished chrome. Arthur killed the engine of his Ford, the rusted muffler, giving one last loud sputter that echoed obscenely across the manicured lawns. He stepped out. The air smelled of roasted pecans and expensive cologne. He found the gymnasium. It was vast, smelling intensely of lemon floor wax and catered vanilla pastries. Fathers in tailored midnight blue suits and imported Italian loafers stood in clusters discussing bond yields and golf handicaps. And there, standing by a stack of folding chairs, was Chloe. She wore a plaid skirt and a white blouse, her posture rigidly perfect. When she spotted him, her grey eyes scanned him from the scuffed toes of his boots to the frayed collar of his dress shirt. "Your lapels are too wide," she said by way of greeting. "Good morning to you too, kid," Arthur muttered, adjusting his tie. It felt like a noose. "Let's just get this over with. What's the damage?" "Station 4. The Windsor Knot demonstration," she instructed, turning on her heel. Arthur followed her to a row of mirrors where several fathers were standing behind their sons, laughing as they fumbled with silk ties. Chloe picked up a maroon tie from a velvet tray and held it out to him. She didn't look at him. She looked at the floor. "I don't need one," she whispered, her voice suddenly sounding very small, very Seven. "But we have to stand here for 5 minutes." Arthur looked at the back of her neck, at the impeccable tight braids. He took the tie from her. "Turn around," he said gently. She hesitated, then turned, her small chin lifted in defiance. Arthur stepped close, the scent of lavender shampoo wafting from her hair. He draped the silk around her small collar. His hands were massive against her delicate shoulders. His knuckles were bruised purple from a slipped hammer. A jagged red scratch ran down the side of his thumb. He saw her eyes darting to his hands in the mirror, tracking the rough, calloused skin as it manipulated the smooth silk. He crossed the wide end over the narrow, up through the loop, down around. He didn't speak. The ambient noise of the gymnasium faded into a dull roar. He tightened the knot, pushing it up to her collar with a thumb that felt like sandpaper. "There," he said, stepping back. Chloe touched the knot. Her fingers lingered on the silk. For a second, the armor cracked. She looked at him in the mirror, a profound, quiet confusion in her eyes. It wasn't a transaction anymore. It was a father tying a tie. "Attention! Everyone line up for the 3-legged sprint!" A cheerful voice boomed over a megaphone. Chloe instantly straightened the moment gone. "I am fast," she warned him. They moved to the starting line. Arthur knelt, wrapping a thick burlap rope around his right ankle and her left. The contrast was stark, his heavy, battered boot against her polished Mary Jane. "Ready?" he asked. "Don't slow me down, Arthur," she commanded. The whistle blew. They surged forward. For the first 10 yards, they were a machine. Chloe was surprisingly vicious, pulling him along. But Arthur's right knee, shot to hell from a decade of carrying roofing shingles, buckled on the polished hardwood. He went down hard, dragging Chloe with him. They collapsed into a tangled heap of charcoal wool, plaid and burlap. Arthur hit the floor with a heavy grunt. He squeezed his eyes shut, anticipating the sharp sting of her disappointment. He expected her to yell. He expected her to demand a refund. Instead, he heard a sound. A tiny, high-pitched hiccup. He opened his eyes. Chloe was sitting on the floor, her skirt bunched up, her perfect braids slightly skewed. She had a hand over her mouth. Her shoulders were shaking. She was laughing. It was a rusty, unused sound, but it was real. Arthur stared at her, stunned, and then a slow, deep chuckle rumbled up from his own chest. He lay back on the waxed floor, laughing with the billionaire's daughter, the absurdity of the whole situation washing over him. "Are you quite finished?" The voice was ice water. Arthur's laughter died. He sat up. Standing at the edge of the mat, casting a long, cold shadow over them, was Victoria. She was wearing a trench coat over a silk dress, holding a leather travel bag. She smelled of sandalwood and exhaustion. "Mother!" Chloe gasped, scrambling to her feet, her face instantly draining of color. The laughter vanished, replaced by the sterile, vacant obedience Arthur had seen on his porch. "Your flight to Tokyo. Typhoon over the Pacific. Grounded until noon," Victoria said flatly. Her grey eyes flicked to Arthur, taking in his cheap, wrinkled suit and the rope binding his leg to her daughter's. Her jaw tightened. "Get up, Mr. Pendleton. You're making a spectacle." The parking lot was practically empty by the time Arthur walked out. The crisp autumn air felt sharp in his lungs after the suffocating vanilla heat of the gymnasium. He was limping slightly, his bad knee throbbing a dull, persistent rhythm. Victoria was waiting by his truck. Her black SUV was parked idling, 20 yards away, a driver reading a newspaper in the front seat. She looked wildly out of place next to the rusted quarter panels of Arthur's Ford. "Here," she said, holding out a plain white envelope as he approached. Arthur didn't take it immediately. He looked at her outstretched hand, the pristine manicure, the heavy gold watch circling her wrist. He reached into his jacket, pulled out the folded $5,000 check and stared at it. The transaction was complete. The charade was over. "She laughed," Arthur said, his voice low, raspy. Victoria's hand remained steady. "Excuse me. When we fell, she laughed, a real actual kid's laugh," he said, looking up from the check to meet her eyes. "I get the feeling she doesn't do that much in your glass house." A muscle twitched under Victoria's left eye. The coldness didn't leave her face, but it hardened, becoming brittle. "My daughter's emotional state is not your concern. You provided a service. You are being compensated. Take the envelope, Mr. Pendleton." Arthur took it. He felt the thick wad of cash inside. It made him feel dirty. He shoved both the check and the envelope into his jeans pocket. "Whatever you say, boss." He yanked open the door of his truck. The hinges screamed. "Try being home before she's asleep tonight. It's free." He slammed the door, turned the key, and backed out, leaving her standing in the swirling exhaust. By Saturday afternoon, the money was in the bank, and 50 bundles of asphalt shingles sat on Arthur's front lawn. The sky was an unforgiving, cloudless blue, beating down on the roof. Arthur was up there, shirtless, a bandana tied around his forehead. The smell of hot tar and old cedar was suffocating. Every swing of the hammer sent a jolt of pain up his arm, but he welcomed it. The physical labor was honest. It drowned out the memory of Victoria's sterile checkbook and Chloe's small, sad eyes in the mirror. Down in the yard, Toby was conducting a full-scale military operation in the dirt. He was 8, missing a front tooth, and permanently covered in a layer of grime. He was making explosion sounds, crashing a plastic dump truck into a mound of topsoil near the property line. The property line was defined by an 8-foot-tall wrought iron fence, spikes on top, black, forbidding. Arthur paused, wiping a mixture of sweat and roofing grit from his brow with his forearm. He looked down. Standing on the other side of the iron bars, perfectly still, was Chloe. She was wearing a white cashmere sweater and pressed trousers. She looked like a ghost, haunting the edge of a muddy reality. Toby stopped his truck. He looked up, spotting her through the bars. He wiped his nose on the back of his sleeve. "Hey." "Hello," Chloe said. She didn't move closer. "You live in the big black house?" Toby asked, walking toward the fence, dragging the dump truck by a string. "Yes, I'm Toby." He shoved his hand through the iron bars. It was coated in wet mud. Chloe looked at the hand. She looked at her pristine cashmere. She didn't move. "I am Chloe. I am not supposed to touch dirt. It carries pathogens." Toby withdrew his hand, wiping it casually on his jeans. "Okay. Want to see my worm?" "It's a fat one." Arthur watched from the roof, his hammer forgotten in his grip. The juxtaposition was brutal. Two kids separated by an inch of iron and 1,000,000 miles of circumstance. Toby rich in nothing but freedom and mud. Chloe possessing everything except a childhood. He saw Chloe lean forward slightly, her grey eyes tracking the squirming pink earthworm Toby had unearthed. There was hunger in her stare. Not for the worm, but for the messy, unscripted reality of it. Arthur looked up past the fence to the massive glass walls of the Hayes estate. Standing on the second-floor balcony, a silhouette against the dark tint, was Victoria. She was holding a phone to her ear, but she wasn't pacing. She was standing dead still, looking down at the fence line. Looking at her daughter, watching a boy play in the dirt, Arthur didn't think. He didn't weigh the social consequences. He climbed down the ladder, the rungs biting into his boots. He walked into the kitchen, grabbed the cardboard box sitting on the counter, and walked out the back door. He approached the fence. Toby looked up. "Dad, she won't hold the worm." "That's probably for the best, buddy," Arthur said. He stepped right up to the iron bars. He looked down at Chloe. She took a half step back, her eyes guarded. Arthur didn't say a word. He opened the cardboard box. Inside was half a pepperoni pizza from the cheap joint down the street. The grease had soaked into the cardboard. It smelled intensely of garlic, salt, and baked cheese. He pulled out a slice. The cheese stretched. He shoved it through the iron bars, holding it out to her. "Pathogens," Arthur said quietly. "Take it." Chloe stared at the greasy triangle. She looked at Arthur's rough tar-stained fingers holding it. She swallowed hard. Slowly her small hand reached through the bars. She pinched the crust, pulling it toward her. She took a tiny tentative bite. Her eyes widened. "Pendleton." Arthur didn't flinch. He looked up. Victoria was walking down the manicured slope of her lawn off her phone, her face a mask of absolute fury. The expensive leather boots she wore snapped the immaculate grass. She marched up to the fence, staring in horror at the grease staining her daughter's chin. "What do you think you are doing?" She hissed the iron bars, separating them like a prison wall. Arthur took a bite of his own slice, chewing slowly. He looked Victoria dead in the eye, the taste of cheap pepperoni sharp in his mouth. "Parenting," he said. Victoria didn't yell. Yelling was for people who lacked leverage. Instead, she reached through the iron bars with a speed that defied her tailored suit and slapped the pizza out of Arthur's hand. The greasy triangle hit the meticulously landscaped Kentucky bluegrass with a dull, disrespectful splat. Chloe flinched back, her shoulders instantly drawing up to her ears. The small tentative spark that had briefly lit her grey eyes extinguished, replaced by a hollow, practiced blankness. She wiped her mouth with the back of her wrist, smearing a streak of orange grease across her pale cheek. "If you ever offer my daughter food again, I will have you arrested for endangerment," Victoria said. Her voice didn't rise above a conversational volume, but the tremor of pure adrenaline underneath it vibrated against the iron fence. Arthur looked at the pizza in the dirt. He looked at his empty hand. The muscles in his jaw corded tight and hot. He wiped his tar-stained fingers on his jeans. Endangerment. Right. Because cheese is a lethal weapon. You don't know her dietary restrictions. You don't know her medical history. Victoria pulled a pristine white handkerchief from her pocket and shoved it through the bars, scrubbing roughly at Chloe's face. The girl stood perfectly still, accepting the harsh friction without a sound. "You know nothing, Mr. Pendleton." "I know she's hungry," Arthur fired back. "And not just for calories, lady. Look at her." Victoria stopped wiping. Her eyes snapped to Arthur, cold and venomous. "Go back to your roof. Before I decide the noise from your hammer is a nuisance and have the police shut your renovation down. I own the borough council, Arthur. Do not test me." She grabbed Chloe's hand, not gently, but with the firm, clinical grip of a handler, and turned away. "She laughed yesterday." Arthur called after them, the words tearing out of his throat before his pride could stop them. Victoria didn't pause. She marched up the slope, her boots stabbing the turf. Chloe didn't look back. The massive glass doors of the mansion swallowed them whole, sliding shut with a heavy, pressurized seal. Arthur stood by the fence for a long time. The smell of garlic hung faintly in the air, mocking him. He picked up the dropped pizza, tossed it into a rusted trash can by his garage, and climbed back up his ladder. For the next 3 days, the Hayes estate was a tomb. Arthur ripped up old cedar shingles and laid down tar paper until his back felt like it was strung with razor wire. He watched the sprawling yard next door. Nothing moved. No gardeners, no drivers. Most importantly, no small girl in silk pajamas. Toby asked about the sad girl once. Arthur told him she was busy. Toby accepted this with the easy indifference of an 8-year-old and went back to building dirt ramps for his bicycle. Arthur wished he could let it go that easily, but every time he closed his eyes, he saw Chloe's desperate, tiny bite of that crust. He saw the iron bars framing her face like a prisoner. Thursday evening brought rain, a cold, relentless October downpour that turned the dirt in Arthur's yard into thick, unyielding mud. Arthur was at the kitchen sink, scrubbing the black roofing tar from under his fingernails with a bristled brush and harsh dish soap. The water ran a murky, bruised purple. The knock on his door was sharp, frantic. Arthur dried his hands, the towel scraping against his raw knuckles. He expected Toby's friend from down the street, maybe looking to retrieve a forgotten toy. He opened the door and found Victoria. She stood under the flickering porch light water, streaming off a black designer umbrella. She wore a sleek trench coat, but the immaculate armor was cracked. Her ash-blonde hair, usually pinned in a severe knot, had a few stray wet strands clinging to her neck. Her mascara wasn't running. She probably bought the stuff that could survive a monsoon, but the skin under her eyes was bruised with exhaustion. "She won't eat," Victoria said. No greeting, no preamble, just a desperate, ragged statement. Arthur leaned against the doorframe, letting the cold air wash over his bruised chest. "What do you mean she won't eat?" "Since Saturday." Victoria lowered the umbrella a fraction, the rain drumming a frantic beat against the taut nylon. "She refuses the chef. She refuses the replacements I brought in. She sits at the dining table and She asks for the pathogen." Arthur stared at her. A harsh, rusty laugh scraped its way up his throat. He tried to swallow it, but it slipped out. "The pathogen. It isn't funny," Victoria hissed, stepping closer. The scent of sandalwood and rain-soaked silk drifted toward him. She has lost 3 pounds. Her pediatrician wants to admit her for intravenous fluids if she doesn't consume solid food by tomorrow. She won't speak to me. She just stares at the wall and asks for you. So buy her a pizza, Arthur said flatly. I bought a franchise. Victoria snapped the sheer absurdity of her wealth, bleeding through her panic. I had them bring a commercial oven to the guest house. She wouldn't touch it. She said it wasn't right. It wasn't dirty. Arthur closed his eyes. He pictured the sterile, temperature-controlled dining room of the Hayes house, the silver platters, the suffocating silence. He opened his eyes and looked at the billionaire standing on his rotting wooden porch. She doesn't want the pizza, Victoria. She wants out of the cage. Victoria's jaw clenched. She reached into her coat pocket. The familiar motion made Arthur's blood pressure spike. Don't pull a checkbook on me, he warned, his voice dropping an octave. I swear to God, you pull a checkbook, I'm slamming this door. Her hand froze inside her pocket. She slowly withdrew it empty. The defeat in her posture was subtle, a slight drop of the shoulders, a waver in her rigid spine, but it was there. What do you want, Arthur? She asked. The ice was gone. She just sounded tired. Bring her over. Now. Tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock. She wears jeans. Real jeans, not some $500 designer denim that she's afraid to ruin. An old t-shirt. Sneakers. Arthur stepped back, preparing to close the door. And she stays until I say she goes home. No nanny. No security detail in the bushes. Just her. Victoria's breath hitched. I can't just leave her in this environment. Then let her get an IV, Arthur said coldly. Your call. He didn't wait for her to answer. He pushed the heavy oak door shut, the latch, clicking with an awful heavy finality. He stood in the hallway for a long time, listening to the rain, wondering if he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. She arrived at 8:59 a.m. The rain had passed, leaving the morning air scrubbed clean and bitterly cold. Arthur was in his detached garage, which served as a makeshift carpentry shop. The air inside smelled of motor oil, damp concrete, and freshly cut pine. The radio in the corner hummed with low-volume classic rock. Arthur looked up from the table saw. Chloe stood in the driveway. She was technically wearing what he had demanded. Jeans, a t-shirt, sneakers. But the jeans were stiff, dark indigo, with not a single faded crease. The t-shirt was stark white and completely devoid of wrinkles, bearing a subtle microscopic designer logo on the hem. The sneakers were blindingly white, looking as if they had just been unboxed. She looked intensely uncomfortable, standing rigidly on the cracked asphalt, like she was waiting for it to give way. Victoria's black SUV idled at the curb. The tinted window rolled down halfway. Victoria didn't look at Arthur. She kept her eyes fixed on the steering wheel. A moment later, the window rolled up, and the heavy vehicle glided silently down the street, disappearing around the corner. Arthur grabbed a rag, wiping sawdust from his forearms. He walked out to the driveway. "Morning, kid," he said. Chloe didn't meet his eyes. She stared at the oil stain near his boots. "My mother says I am to obey your instructions today, to facilitate a return to my baseline caloric intake." Arthur snorted. "Your baseline what, Jesus? Come here." He led her into the garage. Toby was already there, sitting on an overturned plastic bucket, violently sanding a small block of wood. Dust coated his jeans and his hair. "Hey, Chloe!" Toby yelled over the radio, not stopping his frantic sanding. "We're making birdhouses. Dad says mine looks like a drunk pigeon built it." Chloe stared at the chaos. Tools were scattered across the workbench. A rusted coffee can overflowed with bent nails. The floor was a carpet of wood shavings. It was an assault on her sterile sensibilities. "Sit," Arthur commanded, pointing to a battered wooden stool near his workbench. She walked over, inspecting the seat for a full 5 seconds before gingerly lowering herself onto it. She kept her knees pressed tightly together, her hands folded in her lap. "All right," Arthur said, tossing a piece of rough-cut pine onto the bench in front of her. "Your turn. We're building a box. 4 sides, a roof, a hole. Simple." He placed a block of sandpaper next to the wood. "Smooth the edges. Don't stop until it feels like glass." Chloe looked at the sandpaper. She looked at Arthur. "Is there a machine to execute this?" "Yeah. It's called your right arm," Arthur said. "Get to work." He turned his back on her, firing up the table saw. The mechanical shriek filled the garage, drowning out the radio. Out of the corner of his eye, he watched her. She sat frozen for a long minute. The noise, the dust, the lack of explicit, step-by-step corporate directives, it paralyzed her. Then slowly she reached out. Her small fingers closed around the coarse sandpaper. She dragged it across the pine block. It made a harsh scratching sound. She grimaced, looking at her hand. But she did it again. An hour passed. Arthur moved around the shop, checking Toby's chaotic progress, measuring cuts, purposely ignoring Chloe. She needed to exist without an audience. By 10:30, her stark white t-shirt had a smudge of dirt across the stomach. Her braided hair was fraying slightly, picking up static from the sawdust. She was rubbing the sandpaper back and forth with a rhythmic, almost hypnotic intensity. "Done," she announced, suddenly dropping the sandpaper. Arthur walked over. He ran his thumb along the edge of the pine. It wasn't perfect. It was uneven on one side. But it was smooth. Not bad. "Now we glue." He handed her a bottle of industrial wood glue. The cap was crusted over with dried amber sap. Chloe squeezed the bottle with both hands, her face scrunching up with effort. A thick, uneven glob of glue spurted onto the wood, oozing over the side. "Oh!" she gasped, her eyes widening in horror. She reached out instinctively to stop the spill. "Don't!" Arthur started. Too late. Her bare finger pressed into the glue, and as she slid her hand down to catch the drip, the rough edge of the wood caught her palm. A sharp, tiny intake of breath. Chloe yanked her hand back. A splinter thick as a sewing needle was embedded right in the fleshy part of her palm. A tiny bead of bright red blood welled up around it. The garage went dead silent. Even Toby stopped sanding. Chloe stared at her hand, her breathing hitched, accelerating into rapid, shallow pants. The panic in her eyes was absolute. It wasn't just the pain, it was the violation of her physical perfection. In the Hayes household, a cut was an emergency, requiring sterilized equipment and a physician on retainer. "Hey," Arthur said, his voice low, steady, cutting through the rising panic. He knelt beside her stool. "Look at me." Her grey eyes, wide and terrified, snapped to his face. "It's wood," Arthur said simply. "It bites sometimes. It's fine." "Pathogens," she whispered, her voice trembling violently. "Tetanus, septicemia." "Splinter," Arthur corrected gently. He reached into his back pocket and pulled out a clean, albeit faded, cotton bandana. He didn't ask permission. He took her small, trembling hand in his massive, calloused one. "Take a deep breath." She inhaled sharply. In one swift, practiced motion, Arthur pinched the exposed end of the splinter between his thick thumbnails and yanked it out. Chloe let out a sharp squeak. A larger drop of blood bloomed on her palm. "Press," Arthur said, wrapping the bandana around her hand and pressing her own fingers over it. "Hold it tight." He stood up, walked to a metal first aid box mounted on the wall, and pulled out a cheap plastic bandage featuring a faded cartoon dinosaur. He walked back, removed the bandana, and wiped away the blood. The cut was minuscule. He slapped the dinosaur bandage over it. "Amputation averted," Arthur said dryly. "Arthur." Chloe stared at the cartoon dinosaur. She traced the plastic edge with her thumb. The hyperventilating stopped. The tears that had threatened to spill retreated. She looked down at the smear of blood on the cotton bandana, then at her bandaged hand, then at the wood block. "It's sticky," she observed, looking at the glue still drying on her fingers. "It washes off," Arthur said. "Usually." He walked to the battered mini-fridge in the corner, opened the freezer compartment, and pulled out a plastic sleeve of cheap blue raspberry freeze pops. He tossed one to Toby, who caught it with a chair, and handed the other to Chloe. She took the frozen plastic tube. She didn't ask for a plate. She didn't ask for a napkin. She bit the plastic top off with her teeth, just like she'd seen Toby do, and sucked the bright blue ice. She looked up at Arthur. Her lip was stained blue. Her white t-shirt was ruined. She had a dinosaur on her hand, and for the first time since he met her, her eyes looked their actual age. 200 yards away, hidden behind the tinted glass of her second-floor office, Victoria watched through a high-powered brass telescope. She saw the blood. She saw the bandage. She saw the blue dye staining her daughter's mouth. Victoria gripped the edge of her mahogany desk until her knuckles turned bone-white. The emotion clawing at her throat wasn't anger this time. It was a vicious, hollow jealousy, dark and consuming. The roofer had broken her daughter in 3 hours. And worse, he had somehow put her back together. The kitchen smelled of boiled starch and the artificial aggressive tang of powdered cheddar. Arthur stood at the stove, stirring a pot of elbow macaroni with a wooden spoon that had splintered at the handle 3 years ago. The linoleum floor under his boots was peeling at the corners, curling upward like dead leaves. Steam coated the window above the sink, blurring the grey afternoon light into a dull haze. At the scratched formica table, Chloe and Toby sat side by side. Arthur grabbed the foil packet of cheese powder, tore the top off with his teeth, and dumped the neon orange contents into the pot. He added a splash of whole milk and a hefty slice of cheap salted butter. He stirred violently. The sound was a wet, heavy slop. He walked over and dropped a plastic primary red bowl in front of Chloe. It was brimming with the fluorescent pasta. He set a mismatched metal fork next to it. "Eat," Arthur said. He didn't hover. He didn't coax. He walked back to the counter and started scraping the burnt edges off a piece of toast for himself. Chloe stared at the bowl. In her world, meals were plated with tweezers. They involved microgreens and poached proteins and reductions that took 12 hours to simmer. This was a mound of gelatinous, radiating orange sludge. She looked at Toby. Toby had already shoved a massive forkful into his mouth, cheese smeared across his chin. He chewed loudly, kicking his feet against the rungs of the chair. Chloe picked up the fork. She poked the macaroni. It squished. She brought a single noodle to her mouth and bit down. The salt hit her tongue, first sharp and undeniable, then the processed, buttery fat. It was a sensory shock to a system raised on organic blandness. Her jaw stopped moving for a second. Then she swallowed. She scooped up 3 more noodles. Arthur watched her in the reflection of the toaster. She wasn't just eating, she was inhaling it. She was starving, and this was calorie-dense survival food. The heavy authoritative knock on the front door shattered the quiet rhythm of the kitchen. Arthur sighed, dropping his butter knife. He knew who it was. The timing was too precise. He walked down the narrow hall, wiping his hands on a dish towel. He opened the door. Victoria stood on the porch. She wasn't wearing a trench coat today. She wore a tailored grey wool blazer and dark slacks, but the composure that usually held her together like titanium was fracturing. Her eyes darted past Arthur, trying to see down the hallway. "It's 1:15, she said. Her voice was tight, clipped. "I need to ascertain her status." "Her status is eating lunch," Arthur said, blocking the doorway with his frame. "I want to see her." "She's fine, Victoria. Go back to your spreadsheets." Victoria stepped forward, her shoulder checking Arthur's chest. It wasn't a physical match. He had 100 pounds and 8 inches on her, but the sheer force of her desperation made him step back. She pushed past him, her expensive leather heels clicking frantically against the cheap hardwood. Arthur cursed under his breath and followed her into the kitchen. Victoria stopped dead in the doorway. Chloe was halfway through the bowl. The stark white designer t-shirt now featured a vibrant neon orange splatter dead center. Her lips were stained with grease. She had the dinosaur bandage prominently displayed as she gripped the metal fork in a fist. She looked up when her mother entered. The fork froze halfway to her mouth. The relaxed slope of her shoulders instantly vanished, replaced by the rigid, terrified posture of a soldier caught out of uniform. Victoria stared at the macaroni. She stared at the stain on the shirt. The silence in the kitchen grew so heavy it felt hard to breathe. The refrigerator compressor kicked on with a loud rattling hum. "Chloe!" Victoria breathed. It wasn't a reprimand. It was a shock. "It's 50 cents a box," Arthur said, leaning against the counter, crossing his arms. "And she's eaten more of it in 10 minutes than she probably has of your private chef's food in a month." Victoria ignored him. She took a slow step toward the table. Her eyes tracked the grease on her daughter's chin, the cheap bandage on her hand. She looked at Toby, who was watching the scene with wide, confused eyes, a noodle hanging out of the corner of his mouth. "You're eating," Victoria said softly. "Yes, Mother," Chloe whispered. She carefully set the fork down, aligning it perfectly parallel to the edge of the red plastic bowl. The robotic obedience was back. The kid who had been furiously sanding wood an hour ago was gone. Victoria looked at the half-empty bowl. She reached out her manicured fingers, hovering over the neon orange mess. She looked physically ill. "What is in this?" "Do you have the packaging I need to check the sodium levels? The artificial dyes—" "Stop!" Arthur interrupted. He pushed off the counter, stepping between Victoria and the table. He was close enough to smell the faint sandalwood perfume masking her nervous sweat. "You're ruining it." "I'm attempting to monitor my daughter's ingestion of literal poison," Victoria hissed her voice, dropping to a furious whisper so the kids wouldn't hear. "She was starving. Now she's not. That's the only metric you need right now." Arthur stared down at her. She felt safe enough to make a mess. "Look at her now. You walked in and she turned back into a statue. You did that." The words hit Victoria like a physical blow. She flinched, her eyes dropping from Arthur's face to the scratched floor. Her throat worked as she swallowed hard. She looked past Arthur's shoulder at Chloe. Chloe was sitting perfectly still, hands folded in her lap, waiting for the verdict. "Finish your meal, Chloe," Victoria managed to say, her voice cracking slightly on the final syllable. She turned sharply on her heel and walked out of the kitchen back down the hallway. She didn't leave the house. She stopped in the small, cramped living room, staring blindly at Arthur's faded corduroy sofa. Arthur looked back at the table. "Eat, kid," he said gently. Chloe picked up the fork, but the mechanical rhythm was gone. She took a tiny, hesitant bite, watching the hallway where her mother had disappeared. The neon orange truce had been breached. Arthur let the kids finish in silence before sending them out to the tiny fenced-in backyard. Toby immediately handed Chloe a stick and pointed at a pile of dead leaves. She held the wood gingerly standing on the patchy grass, as if waiting for it to swallow her. Arthur walked into the living room. Victoria was standing by the window, looking out at the yard through the dusty blinds. She hadn't moved in 10 minutes. Her arms were crossed tightly over her chest, gripping her own elbows, as if physically holding herself together. "I don't have an espresso machine," Arthur said, walking toward the kitchen. I have drip coffee that tastes like battery acid. You want a cup? No, Victoria said. She didn't turn around. Arthur went to the kitchen anyway, poured the black sludge-like coffee into a chipped mug, and walked back. He sat heavily in the armchair across from the sofa, the springs groaning in protest. He took a sip. It was terrible. He drank it anyway. She got a splinter, Victoria said, her voice flat, devoid of its usual commanding cadence. I saw through the window. You extracted it. Yeah, wood bites. Arthur rubbed his thumb over the ceramic handle of his mug. She survived. Dinosaurs have healing properties. Victoria finally turned away from the window. The harsh afternoon light caught the faint lines of exhaustion around her mouth. She looked around the room, at the stack of unpaid bills on the coffee table, at the scuff marks on the baseboards, at the framed photo of Arthur and Toby on the mantel. Toby was 3, Arthur was smiling. A woman with dark hair stood beside them, half obscured by a glare on the glass. Victoria slowly lowered herself onto the edge of the corduroy sofa. She looked completely out of her element, a diamond set in cheap tin. I pay people, Victoria said, slowly staring at her hands. I pay the best pediatricians. I pay nutritionists who construct optimal dietary profiles. I pay security teams to ensure the perimeter is sealed. You pay for a lot of walls, Arthur noted quietly. I built an empire from absolutely nothing, Arthur. Nothing. Her grey eyes flashed a brief resurgence of the ruthless CEO. My mother worked 3 jobs and still couldn't afford heating oil in January. I promised myself my child would never know what it feels like to be cold, to be hungry, to be denied access to the best resources on the planet. And you succeeded, Arthur said. She's not cold, but she's freezing to death in that house. Victoria's jaw tightened. She looked back toward the window. Outside, Toby was showing Chloe how to crush a dry leaf. She was doing it slowly, watching the brittle pieces fall to the dirt. I don't know how to do what you did today, Victoria admitted. The confession sounded like it was being dragged out of her with pliers. I don't know how to sit in a filthy garage and let her bleed. I don't know how to feed her garbage and watch her smile. It's not a strategy, Victoria. It's just letting her exist. Arthur set his mug down on a faded coaster. You treat her like an asset that needs to be optimized. She's 7. She needs to scrape her knee. She needs to eat junk food and feel sick. She needs to know that when she falls, her mom is going to pick her up, not fire the nanny. Victoria closed her eyes. A single jagged breath shuddered through her chest. My flight to Zurich is rescheduled for Sunday. I will be gone for 2 weeks. The merger is critical. If I step back now, the board will initiate a vote of no confidence. Arthur leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. So go to Zurich. Victoria opened her eyes. She reached into her blazer. Not a checkbook this time. She pulled out a heavy matte black card. I want to put you on retainer. Arthur stared at the card. A laugh, sharp and bitter, escaped him. You really can't help yourself, can you? Listen to me, Victoria said, her voice urgent, dropping the corporate speak. I can't fix how I am built by tomorrow. I can't undo the schedule. But I saw her face in your kitchen. I saw her laugh at that absurd 3-legged race. She leaned forward, the black card hovering over the coffee table. $50,000. For 2 weeks. You take her during the day. You let her build the birdhouses. You feed her the macaroni. You let her get dirty. Arthur looked at the card. 50 grand. It was a life-altering sum. It was a new truck, a repaired roof, a college fund started for Toby. It was breathing room. It was everything he stayed awake at night, agonizing over. He looked at Victoria. Her eyes were desperate. She wasn't trying to buy him off anymore. She was trying to buy a childhood for her daughter because she didn't have the time or the capacity to provide it herself. Arthur slowly reached out. His calloused, tar-stained fingers brushed against the sleek, cold plastic of the card. He didn't pick it up. He pushed it back across the table toward her. Victoria's face fell. "Arthur, please. I am not insulting you. I am begging you." "I know you are," Arthur said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "But if I take that money, I become an employee. I become another Beatrice. And the second Chloe realizes she's just another line item on my payroll, that wall goes right back up." He stood up, his bad knee popping loudly in the quiet room. He looked down at the billionaire sitting on his cheap couch. "I'll take her," Arthur said, "for the 2 weeks. She can stay here during the day. She can ruin her clothes and eat cheap food." Victoria stared up at him, bewildered. Why would you do that for nothing?" "I'm not doing it for nothing," Arthur said, walking toward the back door. "When you get back from Zurich, you're coming over for dinner. You're going to sit at that scratched table, and you're going to eat the neon orange macaroni. Deal." Victoria looked at the black card on the table, then at Arthur's broad, tired shoulders. "Deal," she whispered. The 2 weeks were a chaotic blur of pine shavings, scraped knees, and an alarming amount of refined sugar. Arthur's house absorbed Chloe the way dry earth drinks a flash flood. On day 3, she ruined a $400 cashmere sweater with industrial wood stain. Arthur had handed her one of Toby's oversized faded graphic tees. She wore it for 3 days straight. On day 8, she lost her front right incisor, biting into a stale graham cracker. She hadn't panicked. She had marched up to Arthur, held out her small palm with the bloody tooth resting in the center, and demanded to know the current market exchange rate for the tooth fairy. By the time the black SUV rolled to a stop at the curb on a humid Thursday evening, the transformation was jarring. Arthur was in the kitchen, standing over the stove. The exhaust fan rattled aggressively, doing absolutely nothing to clear the thick, heavy scent of boiled pasta and cheap synthetic cheese. The front door hadn't been locked. He heard the heavy, deliberate click of Victoria's heels on the floorboards. She walked into the kitchen. She looked like she had stepped directly out of a corporate warfare boardroom. Her slate-grey suit was immaculate, her hair pulled back into a weaponized knot. She carried the faint, sterile smell of recycled airplane air and expensive espresso. She stopped in the doorway. At the scratched Formica table, Toby and Chloe were engaged in a violent game of thumb war. Chloe's pristine braids were gone, replaced by a messy, uneven ponytail Arthur had haphazardly tied with a rubber band from the junk drawer. She had a faded yellow bruise on her left cheekbone from a rogue tennis ball. Her fingernails were lined with dirt. She looked up. Arthur braced himself. He waited for the physical recoil. He waited for the billionaire CEO to freeze, for the wall of obedience to slam down over the 7-year-old's face. Chloe dropped Toby's hand. She slid off the chair. She didn't march. She trotted across the peeling linoleum, grabbed the hem of Victoria's tailored blazer with a hand sticky from apple juice, and looked up. "I lost a tooth," Chloe said. She opened her mouth, pointing a dirty index finger at the bloody, empty gap. "Toby says it's worth $1, but considering inflation, I negotiated Arthur up to $5. Victoria stared down at her daughter. Her eyes tracked the yellow bruise, the messy hair, the juice stain on the oversized shirt. Her jaw tightened, the muscles flexing violently. Her hands, trembling, slightly hovered in the air for a second before she slowly lowered them. She didn't pull out a wet wipe. She didn't correct Chloe's posture. She placed her hands on Chloe's shoulders. $5 is a strong settlement, Victoria managed to say, her voice thick catching in her throat. She pulled the little girl against her legs, closing her eyes as she buried her face in the messy, unwashed hair. Arthur turned away, giving them the illusion of privacy. He grabbed the wooden spoon, vigorously stirring the neon orange sludge in the aluminum pot. "Sit down," Arthur said over his shoulder a minute later. "It's getting cold." Victoria pulled away from Chloe. She looked at the scratched chairs. She looked at the sticky table. Then she unbuttoned her expensive blazer, draped it over the back of a chair, and sat down. She looked wildly out of place, a sleek panther sitting in a cardboard box. Arthur walked over. He dropped a red plastic bowl in front of her. It hit the table with a heavy gelatinous thud. He set a mismatched fork beside it. "As promised," Arthur said, pulling up a chair opposite her. Victoria stared into the bowl. The steam rose, carrying the undeniable scent of artificial dye and powdered dairy. It was everything she had spent her adult life insulating herself against. It was cheap. It was common. It was terrible for her. She looked across the table. Chloe was already shoveling the macaroni into her mouth, kicking her feet happily under the table, her shoulder bumping against Toby's. Victoria picked up the fork. Her manicured fingers gripped the cheap metal. She scooped up a small portion of the pasta. She didn't hesitate. She put it in her mouth and chewed. The salt hit her instantly sharp and burning. The texture was mushy, devoid of any culinary merit. It tasted like poverty. It tasted like late-night struggles and skipped utility bills. It tasted exactly like the childhood she had run so desperately away from. She swallowed it. Her throat worked hard. Arthur watched her, his rough hands wrapped around a mug of stale coffee. He didn't gloat. He didn't smile. He just nodded a quiet, profound acknowledgement of the truce. "Well?" Arthur asked quietly. Victoria looked at her daughter, who was laughing with a mouth full of food, the sound loud and unrefined, and beautifully real. Victoria scooped up another bite. "It's repulsive," Victoria said, her eyes meeting Arthur's. A tiny, exhausted smile cracked the ice of her expression. "Pass the salt. Sometimes the highest price you can pay isn't in unmarked bills, corporate buyouts, or black cards. It's in time, patience, and a little neon orange cheese." Arthur and Victoria's worlds shouldn't have mixed, but a 7-year-old's crayon contract forced them to realize that providing isn't always parenting, and surviving isn't always living. If this story hit you right in the chest, do us a favor. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with someone who needs a reminder of what really matters. Drop a comment below. What's your neon orange macaroni, that cheap, messy thing that feels like home? See you in the next one.